That the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Hello, and welcome back to your favorite podcast at the intersection of faith and fear, where every week, and especially this year, and especially this episode, we discuss what scares us in order to find what saves us. This is the fear of God. Speaking to you right now is one of your hosts, Nathan Rouse, and typically with me is fellow co-host Reed Lackey. And you guys, he said something about wanting to go attempt to get through the first gate. Not totally sure. Actually, while Reed is running between two giant naked ladies trying to murder him with their eyes, i.e. just another day for Lackey, allow me to welcome longtime listener, first-time caller, yes, friends and foggers, another guest hailing from the Great White North, where their biggest city is the tiny burg of Toronto. Hey, it's Dave Courtney. Dave, welcome to the show.
Did you just say I was from Toronto?
No, I said from the north, where their biggest city. I'm actually, what you don't know is I'm needling Reed, but he's not here, so he doesn't really get to be needled. But no, I know you're not from Toronto. There are other cities in Canada. But Reed, you know, he's just a silly guy, and that's a Toronto joke at his expense. Maybe if he ever comes back. Hey, while he's gone, I want to take a minute, Dave. So I can't remember. Dave, I do have a question for you that I didn't prep you for, but have you seen Ted Lasso?
I have.
Yeah! Woo! It's good stuff, isn't it?
It is.
It is.
Yeah, it took me a while to get into it.
Okay.
But it is the kind of show that will win you over, even if you try to bet against it.
Huh.
So don't
I like
try.
that. That's a
Give
good
yourself over to it.
Yeah. I mean, you can't win trying to lose against Ted Lasso, huh?
No.
Okay. So, Dave, while we await Reed's, I'm sure, imminent return in one piece, hopefully, allow me to welcome you, sir, to our big series for the year, What Scares Us / What Saves Us, a series defined by you in the plural sense, and you today, Dave. Listeners have been submitting their stories of films and media that instilled or stoked a certain fearful imagining in them, and we're going to be covering those here on the show this year. But I am getting ahead of myself, because here at the Fear of God, we explore, we don't explain, except for right now when I explain that you, listener, can listen to the Fear of God at your nearest podcast platform. You can watch the Fear of God on YouTube, and you can browse the Fear of God on the web at thefearofgodpodcast.com, where you'll find Reed. Hey, buddy, you made it. You made it. It's your speciality.
My scientific speciality.
You are here, Reed. Dave Courtney's here.
Dave, it's very nice to meet you, albeit virtually, but it is very nice to meet you. Thanks so much.
We're doing all the things virtually these days. So.
Everything just exists in a virtual reality. But Dave, seriously, thanks for coming by the show. We're really, really happy to see you.
Well, I appreciate you having me on.
Reed, so you made it through the gate? You okay?
I did.
It was a bit.
I did.
Did you get distracted?
I got a bit distracted, especially. I don't remember how long it had been since I'd seen the just regular version of this movie.
What do you mean the regular version? Is there an alternate version that I don't know?
No,
With
I mean
Kermit the Frog or something?
I know that in many ways, I watched a lot of these movies like on TV, you know,
Sure.
and so I don't remember what the TV version looked like. I just remember that however many dozens and dozens of times I've seen this film, this viewing was the first time I registered.
No,
What's going on with
the first time? You are a liar.
I am not. I am many things. A liar is not one of them.
No? Okay.
I do not. Yeah, this was the first time I ever registered that.
I'll let you have that.
You know what? I mean, you can continue to. I've learned something that you choose to take every opportunity you can to just like poke and prod. Reed likes to read. Reed's a liar. Reed didn't register.
I never call you a liar until just 10 seconds ago.
That's not the best time to say you've never done it.
Yeah. What, Dave?
I got a question. have either of you read the book?
Yes.
Oh yeah.
I've read that one.
Okay.
Nathan the illiterate has spoken.
Okay.
Yes.
I was about to say those statues are not in the book, so they are absolutely a creation of the director for whatever reason.
Wolfgang was like,
this movie needs
let's have
more.
some. Yes.
You know.
If you know, you know. You know. We need some. I am of German descent, so I do not feel any sort of you know, proclivity there.
So we need to move on because that's proving difficult as it, you know, like we're 10-year-old boys watching this movie. But so Reed, before we kind of jump into things, is there any specific business points we need to be business time? We need to be timing for the business?
Funny you should ask. Business time. So so normally we would add something like this at the end of the show. We normally preview upcoming content towards the end of the show. So definitely stay tuned there. But in addition to a handful of films that'll be parsed out over the next couple of weeks, we also have a What Scares Us submission that we will be doing, that we will be giving the TV guideposts treatment to. So a TV series that it's a Netflix original TV series that somebody submitted to us, and we are going to be making our way through The Witcher season 1. So for those of you who have Netflix, you want to check that out. We will be going to the first 2 episodes of that next week, in addition to a film that we'll announce at the end of the episode. But definitely check that out. And that's my primary piece of business. Do you have any business you want to share with folks?
You know, join the Facebook group. Interact with us, interact with Dave here. Leave an iTunes review. Come on.
Yeah.
Come on
now.
Number 80, the impossible.
Who's it gonna
be? Nobody.
The 80, never-ending 80.
The elusive 80. All right, so that's business time. Now, yes, friends and foggers, we do have listener Dave Courtney on with us. And Dave, one, thank you for being here. We love all of our Canadian friends. And I mean, all of our friends, just period, but you know, something special about you guys. I want to start our time with you kind of asking what we ask all guests. And it's kind of a twofold question that you can kind of wrap up together, but ignoring our content for this conversation. So other than that, what would you identify as your or a favorite horror piece, and also kind of enmesh within that answer, attached to that answer, what got you into this genre? Like, what was your gateway? What was your inroad? Maybe what's kept you here, and what's a favorite piece or two within it?
Definitely, I would say my favorite piece is The Exorcism of Emily Rose.
Nice.
That is, I would also say that played a role in getting me into the genre. I came into it late. However, there's a connection with the film we're covering today, in that when we were considering, or when you asked us to consider movies, that one didn't come to mind because I didn't think that I would categorize it as horror. Mm-hmm. Thinking back, I don't know if you're familiar with Susan Cooper's The Dark is Rising series, but
I'm familiar with it, but I haven't read it.
Okay. Yeah. That was a childhood favorite. And I think of that one and I don't immediately think of horror. But after picking up the book for The Neverending Story and watching the movie, it just struck me that, yeah, this is definitely horror, fits in all those ways. And so was the Dark is Rising series, and a lot of the books that I read when I was young, I would probably classify in some way, shape, or form horror. So I think I was drawn to it at a young age as a genre in terms of, you know, what somebody might typically think of horror. Sure. I didn't get into that until much later, but
yeah. Cool.
Yeah, you and I share mildly similar stories there. I dabbled in some of the, you know, novels and whatnot, high school era, but in terms of leaning hard, I always sort of liked scary stuff, but you know, some of the harder elements people think of when they think horror, like what we've covered on the show these last 4 years, didn't really kind of follow that path until old Lackey dragged me down it crying and screaming. Awesome. Thank you so much for being here, Dave, and for offering that to us, as well as choosing today's selection, which I know we're all probably a little excited to get to. But before we do, you know what, Reed? I'm gonna let you try this. I'm gonna let you go for it. You gonna try it?
What you watching? What are you reading? What you listening to?
Come on, Dave.
Tell me, can you see? I don't know how good that was, but you know what? It just, you just...
What a tune, man. What a tune.
Fantastic.
I know we're not
song.
talking about the movie yet, but that's then this is not my what you listening to answer, but that song is so dang good.
It's
like when
wonderful.
I had my kids watch this with me, the middle one conked out within 30 minutes, but the older one, who is a massive Stranger Things fan, as has been discussed, she and I were just singing along to this song when it came out. It was really
awesome.
Really little lovely parental
Awesome. That's fantastic.
Dave, why don't you get us started? What is something, I don't know if you could tell what Reed was saying just there, but it was, what are you watching? It is now that segment. What are you watching, reading, or listening to? How would you answer that for yourself right now, Dave?
I don't know if this is the question you really want to ask me, because we might be here for an hour.
Okay, well, pick one.
I'll narrow
it.
I'll narrow it. Well, there's a couple I want to mention, actually.
Okay.
If only because they're going to connect, I think, a little later on, hopefully, to the discussion.
Okay.
One for pleasure is Shadow and the Bone.
Okay.
Just came out as a series. Somebody recommended me the book, so I started it. Also, for your recommend.
Nice.
Got it from the library.
Yep.
Support your local library.
Yep.
That's right.
Sorry, I guess I should say that, the name of that, because not everybody's watching watching this, right? Yep. 88 Names by Matt Ruff.
Nice.
Yay.
And I was so excited about picking this one up.
That's Bride, a lovely edition.
That's gorgeous.
Collector's edition.
Nice.
Ooh, that's
signed by Andre the Giant. No?
Wow.
No signatures.
No.
But the two that I actually really wanted to point out, one was a book called Work. It's a deep history from the Stone Age to the Age of Robots by James Sussman. Now, this book actually would probably not have been his intent, but man, this book really kind of set a fire under my faith in a weird way, because it really kind of goes to the history of work going all the way back, but where it really rests is it kind of pinpoints a turning point in human history, that it revolves around the discovery of fire. And it talks all about how from fire, the discovery of fire and onwards, that everything kind of shifted in terms of how we function. And what's really cool is it showed how we went from a dependence on or a view of the world where there was abundance, like we didn't have to worry about what was coming next, and we lived in the present, and then we discovered fire, and all of a sudden the narrative changed from abundance to scarcity. And this narrative of scarcity, this idea that we will not have enough, that we can't trust, in, as he says, in the old gods and the relationship between God and the land, this kind of just led us down this path to where we're so focused and obsessed on the future, that it has driven us to do all kinds of things that maybe are opposed to our nature, of being in relationship to God and land. So really, really cool. And then I picked up this book called History and Eschatology, Jesus and the Promise of Natural Theology from M.T. Wright, because I listened to his podcast series.
Nice.
And it's been a really powerful complement to that book, just kind of reconfiguring our relationship to God and land, as opposed to seeing it as separated and irreconcilable. But
wow, that's
Dave,
very cool.
Dave, you're my people, man. Like the books you're dropping, I'm just like, oh my gosh, I gotta write this down. I haven't read those yet. That's very exciting. I'm very, very interested. What was the author's name of the workbook?
James Suzman, Suzman.
Okay, that sounds like a book I would really, really be fascinated by. Thanks for that
Did
recommendation.
Did I just say Zed in a Canadian?
You did,
way?
but I wasn't. But I wasn't unaccustomed to it. I work with in my vocation. I work with a lot of people. In fact, my boss and many of his peers. So our leadership group is based in Europe, and they never say Z. They say Zed like all the time. So I'm very acclimated to it whenever they say it. So I didn't blink at it.
All right.
So that's funny.
And it went right by me. So, you know.
Nathan, what you got? What you been watching? What you been reading? What you been listening to?
Well, I want to keep up with my trend of illiteracy and reference a non-book. But I don't, Dave, despite our interactions online, I actually don't know if you're in the camp of enjoying this, though I know, Reed, you have watched it, but I just want to, based on timing and schedule, drop some love to The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which just wrapped about a week ago. Dave, are you an MCU person, guy, fan?
I am. I confess I get a little bit lost at this point in terms of the larger mythology of it all, but
it's a lot.
Yeah, I am a fan.
Good. Well, so in broad strokes, unsurprisingly, I guess, I really enjoyed the show. I do think it gets a little muddy at times. Like it makes you kind of wonder a little bit about what's on the cutting room floor and the edit. And
right.
There are a few stretches where you're like, I don't even know what's going on. In fact, my 12-year-old during a later episode, she's like, I'm really confused. And I wanted to say, I'm not going to spell that for you because it's kind of confusing. But so that is kind of a ding against the show. That said, I think what it does well, it does incredibly well. And I was really impressed with how strongly it steers into the race conversation, to the point that anyone who's watched it will remember this moment when in episode 6, Sam Falcon, now spoiler alert, Captain America, is giving his big speech. I was like, okay, the nail has been hit on the head a couple of times in this speech, but I'm okay with it because I'm digging the energy and I like the vibe, so I did not have a total problem with that. But really love where it leaves the toys at the end of the 6 episodes. Though I do think I don't love how quickly it pulls back the John Walker character from Beyond Redemption.
Agreed.
I do think that what they did with him in the center of that series was pretty impressively dramatic, and a little heartstring pulling there for a minute. But anyway, so yes, thoroughly enjoyed it. Let me rephrase that. Enjoyed it a lot. It did have some muddy parts to it. I am excited for Loki, unsurprising to anyone who knows me well. Reed, ultimately, would you echo some of those thoughts on that show?
Almost all of them. I definitely feel like it stumbled its way through a few places. When it was great, it was really powerful.
Yeah.
And I feel like the entirety of its presentation could have been more streamlined. I feel like they did a really good job of getting us to care about Sam and Bucky as the head of their own shows, or their own show and their own adventure. Sam's great. Anthony Mackie, I mean, like, he's just the character is great. The character is endearing. Anthony Mackie is a very charismatic performer. So I just really enjoyed all of that. I agree. One of my biggest sort of like beefs with it was I got really torn about the John Walker thing, because I was like, that moment was so, it was really devastating in a powerful way, powerful storytelling.
And followed by a devastating fight.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so to have him simply, I knew that ideologically he would pivot. That I knew. But to have him end the series, spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't watched it, but to have him end the series basically like already becoming the U.S. agent and already being like, oh, okay, well, he's one of the good guys. I mean, he's literally his last line in the show is "I'm back." You know, like it's, you know, it was too neat. It was too tidy. And I think I would have liked to have seen him maybe wrestling a bit more with the ramifications of what he had allowed himself to become. That's, I think, the only piece that I'm missing. I'm not saying I didn't want him redeemed, not saying that, you know, him being redeemed by the end of the show wasn't a possibility, but I think I would have liked for it to be a little bit less tidy when he did come back around by the end of it. And that's really my major beef with the ending of it, other than like a couple of those other things you mentioned about just some of the clunkiness.
What's on your plate?
So I will for listeners who enjoy all of my book recommendations, I will get back to those imminently, but I'm not going to do a book this time around. I debated a lot about whether or not I was going to use this as my Whatcha watchin for some reasons that'll be made clear in a second, but I will. As we're recording this, the Oscars were Sunday night. As it releases, it'll be two Sundays ago. And, you know, less than 10 million people watched it. It was a significant drop in viewership from the previous, like, 23 to 25 people who normally watch, 23 to 25 million people who normally watch it. So severe drop in viewership. I don't know how many people saw it, but I'm sure people heard about the fact that they had restructured the show to basically end on what they presumed would be the posthumous awarding of Best Actor to Chadwick Boseman for Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. But Anthony Hopkins instead won for The Father. Now, my Whatcha watchin is not a conversation about the Oscars, but I did want to express something that was a bit on the personal side because I through some conversations with you, Nathan, and with some of our other friends, and even a couple of Facebook conversations, I was trying to interrogate for myself because I got really defensive for the Father, like super defensive for it. Now, I saw it before the Oscar ceremony. So my wife and I had seen all of the Best Pictures. So I saw The Father, and honestly, going into it, I thought The Father was just going to be a box check. Oh, okay, this is a film about a man who's wrestling with dementia and his daughter who's trying to cope with all of that. That's probably what it's going to be. Within, and I'm going to try to be very careful about not spoiling key elements, within about 10 minutes of the film, maybe 15, you quickly realize the film is not just that. And that the film, while still wrestling with that subject, is making an effort to put you in a place where you can really comprehend this struggle in ways that I've never seen a film do. And so, like, there's one point at which my wife even leaned over to me and says, "Oh my God, this is, in some ways, it feels like a horror movie." Like, not kidding. Like, just in some of the things that you would not expect. I was prepared for just a morose, heart-tugging drama about a man who was, you know, struggling with the end of his life. And it is a lot of different things than that. Very inventive. And what is demanded of Hopkins as a performer is absurdly high. Like, in terms of just the demands on him as a performer are intense. The waves of emotion that he has to pivot between, believably, sometimes in the span of just a few seconds, and then go right back again, right inside the scene. And then also some of the structure of the film disarms you in a way that generates empathy, generates a profound sense of sort of connection to the experience of what's happening. And I don't think I've been this real transparent on the show about this subject before, but I have very few large existential fears. Like, there's lots of little things, but I have very few that are like, no, that's like probably to the degree of phobia, and so to the degree that I just try not to even think about it. One of those fears is of losing my mind through like a dementia or an Alzheimer's or something like that. I'm a very intellectual person, and so my heart can kind of get away from me in a lot of ways, but the prospect or concept that towards the end of my life or in whatever means, my mind would begin to turn on me is a really deep-seated fear for me. And I'm not saying that to, you know, make the conversation about that. I'm just saying what I began to realize when suddenly, and I'm not taking anything away from like Boseman's brilliance in Ma Rainey's Bottom, because he was utterly brilliant in that, and was performing to that degree while he was battling cancer secretly and privately. So it's a profound performance. But my own sort of reaction to The Father, I was wondering, I was like, why is this such a big deal to me that, I'm getting pretty defensive on behalf of an 83-year-old man who's had a long storied career and probably couldn't care less about whether or not he won this award. He slept through it. It was not a thing. And I was beginning to realize, it's because that film touched on some things that are, and maybe this can act, as a kind of a transition into the film we're talking about because of the what scares us idea. But I think it touched on some things that were really personal to me. And Hopkins does so in a way that feels so uncomfortably real. And he had later said that, there was a lot of his performance that was like a tribute to his father and things like that. And so there's a lot wrapped up in that. And the biggest reason I wanted to mention the film The Father, as my Whatcha is because I think that now the Oscars buzz is over. And now, especially given some people who may not have made it to it and now might be upset at its winning over Boseman, I think there's going to be people who don't see it, who don't either bother to see it or who are out of protest refusing to see it. And I think that would be a real shame because it's a very, very powerful film. And I cannot recommend enough, if you've ever had a family member who struggled with dementia or a neurological disorder that takes their mind from them, if you've ever been in sort of a field that cares for those kind of people, or if you're just interested in seeing a film that has that kind of profound power, I cannot recommend enough to see The Father. It is not a box check. It is a very inventive, powerful film, and I want as many people as possible to see it. So that is my Whatcha, is I want to bring up The Father, starring, for good or ill, Oscar-winning for the second time, Anthony Hopkins. So
Olivia Colman, she got nominated.
She was there, and she but she didn't win for it, but she's great in it,
right?
Yeah. Wow.
I do need to check that box and watch The Father.
You should. Mm-hmm.
All right. What you watching? That's what we've been reading, watching, listening to. Now it's time for Dave's What Scares Us. Dave Courtney from Canada is on the show today, here to share about the film, the German-directed Never-Ending Story.
The commitment. The commitment.
Give me an Oscar.
Is staggering.
Give me an Oscar for that.
Can I explain what you were teasing me about before before I came into the while I was off on my scientific speciality? So and it just pinged my memory because you said that
I'm not sure what you're referring to right now, but go ahead.
Well, because you said one of the biggest cities in Canada is Toronto, even though Dave's not from Toronto, but but it's because. Well, yeah, he is. But it's because last week when I was mentioning Kim's Convenience, I was just, if you're in the Facebook group, which again, join the Facebook group.
You can have the in jokes and they make it to the air just like this. It's amazing. Thanks, Mira.
Is because I said when I was pitching Kim's Convenience, and I said they're not in some big metropolitan area, and she's like, and Vera totally as kindly and gently as we all know Vera can be, she was totally like, it's set in Toronto, which is the biggest city in Canada.
Then sent you a map.
Sent me a map. I was like, okay, all right.
That was Mama Vera correcting her kid. Yeah.
It was hysterical. It was so funny. So anyway, I just had to explain because I thought that was really funny.
Explain the joke.
Wow.
Dave, we have talked for a while and you've sat there patiently and you're like, why am I even here? So you submitted several, actually, right? What Scares Us is.
Yep.
The plural form is What Scares Us is.
We could do a Dave Courtney series, and I'm not saying that jokingly. We absolutely could. It would be great.
Tune in next week. But one of the primary reasons we wanted to have you on specifically was this doggone movie, because it came through and Reed and I were like, what? There is never going to be another time as gifted as it was by you to talk about this film. So would you do us the honor of just, 30 seconds, 30 minutes, maybe not that, but tell us a little bit about submitting this film, without diving too deeply into your notes, kind of what was the impetus for, okay, I want to submit Neverending Story. What did it do for you as a young person, as an older person? Speak a little bit to why the Neverending Story is the answer to the question, what scares Dave Courtney?
Well, I think when I submitted the film, like I said already, it was not on my mind because I didn't think it was a horror film.
Mm-hmm.
And then I picked up the book. I don't know why I got inspired to pick up the book, but I picked it up, I finished the book, and then I decided to rewatch the movie. And with those two things in hand, I was like, oh my goodness, like this is, this is probably the most legitimate thing that would fit as what scared me, because that opening scene in particular, like the opening scene of the nothing, I mean, it's just ingrained in my mind, as is the story. And I mean, the book is much, I wouldn't say, well, it's not much different, but it's much longer than the movie.
Yeah.
And it goes into some other areas. But watching the movie just brought me back. I shared with you guys that childhood picture of me and Bastion.
That was wild.
Maybe I can post it in the Facebook group after, but I think I felt like I had this connection with this story through this kid named Bastion, because I was very much that kid. Like I was the kid who would be, sitting in class, and I would basically, they would go around and with that box from Scholastic. Do you guys have Scholastic?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yep. Oh, yeah.
The book fair.
Right.
Yep.
So they would go and plop, one book here, one book there, and somebody else's desk. And then eventually they would just plop the whole box on mine because that's who I was. I mean, I never really fit in at school. I was that kid who would sneak off upstairs. I remember the second floor of our school, and I would find a little nook and read instead of hanging out with everybody else, because, well, I wasn't really, I wouldn't say I was really, or that I really fit in at school all that well. Sure. I was never thrown in a dumpster, but I was put in a garbage can. So
wow.
I do have which is all to say, I think I felt like I had an affinity with this story. But even more than that, I think a lot of people, look at this movie and they basically summarize it in terms of a message about the childhood imagination, maybe a metaphor for grief, but I think it's actually much bigger than that. There's a lot going on in this film, and the one thing that it tapped into for me was that Reed, you talked about not having a lot of existential fears. I think all of my fears are existential, even though even growing up, I wasn't able to name what those precisely were, but fear gripped me even as a young child and motivated me to want to make sense of this world that I couldn't make sense of. Like, sure. This was my experience. And my mind would spend a lot of time ruminating on, what it is that, what it is that makes this a world where supposedly God exists, but also this is my reality. What makes that kind of fit together? Because it didn't always fit together, even as a young child. So,
yeah. No, I love that. I love that. You referencing the book, and I don't remember. There's a couple years ago. I mean, it's probably 4 or 5 now, maybe a hair more. Where I don't even remember why, but I wanted to read the book, and so did. And honestly, you know, if you're an avid reader or an avid film person, you tend to know that, okay, an adaptation of a book, like the film adaptation of a book, most of the time people are going to say, oh, well, the book's better, which is largely true, just because you can get more kind of inner life of characters and that sort of thing, especially in fiction form. But my one time reading it, I don't really care for the book because of the knowledge I had and the experience I had ingrained in me, because, you know, Pee-wee's Big Adventure, Neverending Story, Beetlejuice, these are the movies of my childhood type of thing. Like Neverending Story was very much on that shelf. And so to be accosted with just such a different iteration of the story, which isn't even a knock against the book, but it was such unfamiliar terrain once you get past the events of the movie, that ultimately I didn't care for the character of Bastian in it, and just ultimately did not really enjoy the reading of it, and wondered, because this is the first time I've watched the movie since reading it, and kind of wondered, would that impact at all? But it truly didn't. I can very easily take the film as the film and kind of love it for exactly what it is.
Well, and it's worth mentioning, maybe, you know, perhaps in passing, the specifics of that, just, you know, for listeners who've never read the book and might, you know, be curious. The events of the movie basically comprise, you know, pretty much the first half of the book. And then after that, the whole seeds of like Bastian, you know, rebuilding Fantasia and everything. And then now it's been quite a number of years since I've read it, because I probably read it somewhere in junior high or high school. I feel like, didn't he like become like the king and
something like that. Yeah.
And they had like they tried to dethrone him at one point because he was just, I don't know, I don't remember all the details, but yeah, I remember him getting like, and then like he eventually sort of makes his way back to you know, to the normal reality or whatever. But I remember, I think I said to you, Nathan, off pod, where I was like, boy, the filmmakers knew right when to end the book. Because like it's such or to end the movie, because it's such a moment of triumph to end the movie on that note of like, okay, he's saved him, you know, and he's riding away on Falcor. And don't we all want to do that? And then that's basically like, okay. And Bastian had many other adventures. We'll talk about those some other time.
Yeah.
So
that's
but
hilarious.
Now so I'm kind of curious, just kind of going around some places, if we want to, just sort of get the blood flowing a little bit on this film. So I have something that's not like hyper direct, but maybe can start something going on it. Is I was gonna ask each of you which of the trials in this film would do you in. Would it be, you know, like pick one? Would it be Swamps of Sadness, the Gates to the Southern Oracle? Would it be, you know, like, would it be Gamork? Would it be, you know, climbing the ivory tower? Would it be, you know, what in this film would be your trial? You'd be like, that's going to undo me. Like, I'm not going to make it past that. And I'll share mine while I give you both a chance to think about it. So, definitively, and I'm not trying to be like jokey or anything, I honest to God think that the one that scares me the most and the one that I think would undo me is the second gate of the second oracle. The whole mirror where you see yourself. In the film, its power is so diluted because all they do is just like, oh man, this gate is so terrible. It's so awful. It's even worse than the first one, you know? And then he gets there, sees Bastian sitting up in the attic, and then just kind of walks through. I'm like, that was not anywhere near like the first one, man. The first one, it was like he could have been burnt to a crisp or whatever. But I honestly think the second one, like being confronted with what I'm really like, would probably be the one that would undermine me, because as much as I might like to think that like, oh, I'm a nice guy and all this kind of stuff, boy, man, it's like confronted with how you really are and how you really think and everything. I would imagine that would undo quite a lot of us, and I'm sure it would probably undo me. So that would be my answer. Is I think the one that would undo me would be the second gate of the second oracle. Dave, what do you think would yours would be?
I think, no question, for me, it would be the sea of possibility, which sounds strange, but here's why, is because the sea of possibility, I might be mixing the book and the movie here. I apologize if I do that along the way, but at the sea of possibility, it says this is, and they could go no further. And this is the scene where we really get, if there's a central question hanging in the film, it's what is the nothing. And this is really where we get that sense of that definition of what the nothing is, which is what is left when you've lost everything, when there is nothing left. That's where we get the nothing, and that's where it says that's what brings the despair, like this odd thing of coming to the edge of that sea of possibility and realizing you cannot go any further in whatever that existential fear is that's been driving you. I think that's what would do me in, because there literally is nothing left.
Yeah, no, that's it. That's a pretty effective answer. Nathan, what do you think?
It's interesting. I wonder, I mean, this is, I'm just sort of hypothesizing and thinking in real time about the question. I even referenced on like Mungo, just sort of some of these elements of my persona and that kind of wistfulness, that kind of splinter in the psyche idea. And I wonder if the swamps of sadness would be a problem for me. In a large way, like there are, I'll frame it this way. There are actual living people for whom depression and clinical things like that are far more debilitated by it than I am. So I'm not trying to play those things down, just processing sort of the question. I do think Morla's information dump of 10,000 miles away, I'd be like, screw it. I'm just gonna dive into the swamp of sadness. I'm just going to will myself down. That, or just, I know it's a self-worth based thing and I'm not going to be jokey about the first gate, but I'm not a fast runner. I hate running. I would be blasted to smithereens just because I'm like, I'm not going to make it, possibly because I have self-worth issues, but also because I'm just not that fast. Good on Atreyu. Reed, did you have any other following for that?
No, not immediately. No.
Because I something I was pondering for you guys was, and it's a bit rhetorical, but a bit possibility to discuss this character. Is there anything, fellas? Dave, first time guest. Reed, long time host. Is there? I'm gonna see how I worded this thing.
Oh no!
Is there anything better? And I'm kind of being serious, than the sound of the laughter of a luck dragon.
Oh my gosh!
What a glorious noise!
It's
thrilling sound.
Yeah. It's deeply rooted in like the belly. It's just, it's wonderful. I want so badly to take a ride on Falkor. I just want Falkor to be a real thing, like in the world. That would be amazing.
The animatronic is, you can go, at least according to the trivial bits, you can go ride Falkor. It's like the thing.
Yeah.
I love Falkor. What a great character.
Falkor is the best. Dave, what's one of your, we're probably going to spend quite a bit of time in the depths on this one, but what's one of your things that when you think about this movie, if there is anything, what's one of the things that you just like have some affection and endearment about? Because I should say, I just asked you a question, and I'm going to preface why I asked it, is because I knew we were covering this film. And when the time came to rewatch it, I was feeling rather ill that day. And so that night I was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to pour myself a hot cup of tea. I'm going to sit on my bed and I'm going to watch The Neverending Story. And from the opening moments, like you mentioned earlier when you were talking about the what scares us piece of it, like the opening moments when the music kicks in and I see the swirling clouds of, you know, the presence of the nothing coming in, like immediately I am already back to like 6-7 years old again, and all of that is just sort of like rising up as endearment to me. So what's something about the film that just like, or if there is anything that just sort of like, oh man, this is just fun, I just enjoy this, I like it?
I probably would cite the old married couple because I mean that can you get a better marriage? I mean,
it's so great.
They have the perfect back and forth banter.
No, it's awesome. No, it's absolutely awesome. I think probably one of my favorites would be, well, Nathan already mentioned Falkor, though I don't know if that would be his. But as scary as he is, and as honestly as debilitating as his information is, I used to love Morla. Like the whole thing where he's just like
10,000 miles away.
But then the dreadful way that he's just, oh no, I know.
Oh.
But then the dreadful way where he's just sitting there's like, I'm tired of sneezing, go away. Just like,
it's pollen season up in there.
It's crotchety old turtle mountain. It's just like, but
yeah, that.
Oh my gosh.
That's
but
hilarious.
No, another thing that I thought was just kind of it just struck me as a little funny, and it's a fantasy film in general, so you can't cite it too much for reality. But I'm like, first of all, there's an attic in this school that evidently there's a key that's just sitting up. Like anybody, why even have a key to this attic? It's just broken there, and anybody can wander up as long as they have the path there. And I keep thinking, like, okay, where's maybe the film just isn't interested in this, but this child stays in there all night. Like he is up in that attic.
It's a different era, Reed.
I know, but I'm just saying, like, what did
like
Dad
New
do?
York City. He's just got the Rome of the city.
Well, yeah, that was the other thing.
Toronto, but
but that's the thing is, it's like, okay, he's in a metropolitan area, because it's like, that's the thing is like, okay, walk to school, and then it shows him like, yeah, he's downtown.
Yeah.
Like what? Like really? And then he goes to school to this place where he's just gonna, okay, so clearly he lives in the inner city, and he's just gonna stay up in the attic all night at school. It's just,
we Southern boys had a very unique kind of upbringing compared to city boys.
I guess so. I guess so.
I mean, I could see a world. I'm sorry to cut you out there, Dave, real quick. I could see, like, you know, having Rome. I mean, my wife talks about, she grew up in, or at least part of her upbringing was in Atlanta, which is itself a pretty metropolitan area. And she'll even these days talk about, so Atlanta, do they still have it? The, doggone, I can't remember the name of it, but it's like a monorail style public transit. And, I feel like a bad Georgia boy that the name's eluding me at the moment, but I wasn't planning to talk about it. But she'll even comment, because like she and her sister and or her friends, as you know, teenagers or young teenagers, would just go hop the thing into Atlanta City and hang out and bebop around, and just how wild that is to consider now.
Yeah,
parenting and the world being such as it is. But on top of that, as far as the kid in the attic at the school goes, now very different, but I'm the child of a public school teacher. So at least in elementary school era, my free reign to a school building was pretty high. Like, and so anyway, point being, I can see a scenario where overnight, that's a little weird, but the ability to just kind of roam unfettered in a school building,
that's fascinating.
I can sort of see that. Dave, what were you going to throw in there? I'm sorry.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't the book address that, like him being in the attic overnight?
You tell us.
Home?
Yeah, it's been a while.
I actually don't remember. No, I actually don't remember if it does or not, because again, it was probably 20 years or more since I read it.
Okay. I'm trying to jog my memory, even though I just recently read it. Because I feel like there's something to do with like the time not being as much as he thought it was.
Oh, like a Narnia situation or something, where like he's there and he's caught up in a bit of, well, which would make sense if he's like interacting with the world of Fantasia, and maybe to him it feels like it's been, you know, on into the night, but really that's probably not as long as he's been there. That would,
I might be completely wrong on that, but I feel like that's plays into it. And then I feel like because in the book you get this reconciliation with his dad in the end.
Yeah.
And that conversation kind of helps make sense of why, you know, he maybe wasn't found up in the attic.
Interesting. Okay. Well, that's interesting. I might have to jog my own memory by just like going back and looking at a couple of those pieces, because this time around watching the film, that was one of the main sort of sticking points. I was like, why is this child just allowed to just be up there and nobody cares? They leave, the whole school building leaves, and the lights turn out 4 minutes later. Like, you know,
that's a good administration, actually. That they're that efficient. You're out.
They're just like, we're done. The bell rang. Teachers, leave. Get out of the lounge.
So I was just scanning my notes here real quick, and you mentioned the challenges earlier, Reed, and my 12-year-old had an astute observation, at least, of the gates, and she just said, why can't they just go around? Like, don't think about it too hard.
Just leave that.
Right. So Dave, I want to invite anything you want to talk about here, but something that, if y'all will permit me, that I want to toss in the mix, because and I'm not being jokey here, but Dave, you and I have never formally met, but we've interacted a good bit online in the last 6 months to a year or so, maybe longer, and you're a very thoughtful, smart person. Reed, I would say the same of you. And so I submit this idea and sort of this question to you guys in the spirit of that, and a little bit of a spirit of humility, because I'm kind of interrogating this idea myself. So the Neverending Story has a unique place in my childhood memory, but the Neverending Story has grown to have a very unique meaning for me as an adult, and even more than that, as an adult of faith. And if I'm being perfectly transparent, I'm a little hesitant to introduce this idea, because it could fall flat. It could be judged by the casual listener, or risk not making any sense whatsoever. But for a long time, I don't know, maybe a decade or more, not in its specific narrative beats, the film, but in how the film paints a picture of, I'm going deep fast, y'all, sorry, of a living text being shaped itself by its reader, the reader in turn being shaped by it, and on, as and this is very true, this is not, I need to introduce something for this conversation. This is my mental image of the Bible. This is how I think about it. For a long time, I've personally set aside the notion of Scripture as textbook, guidebook, as a thing whose interpretation is indispensable from the interpreter. How I think about it in this model, in this image, is what you want to be there is what you will find there. And what you find there is what you'll want to enact in the world. It's fantasy, it's mystery, it is symbiotic, and it is other. It's telling a story we are intrinsically tied up in, while at the same time are observers. I'm kind of tentative in introducing that in, because I don't want to, it feels a little kind of personally risky to introduce that kind of idea, but it's really how I think about and engage with Christian scripture, maybe even beyond pure Christian scripture itself, and however we might define that, which I know feels like a heretical statement. So I just want to, I know it's like throwing a giant magic book into the room, but I want to see kind of what kind of conversation comes out of this. What, apologies if it hijacks some of where it might have gone, but it's just why. Last note here. The Neverending Story, we're I don't know a scenario in which I'm going to have another opportunity to talk about Neverending Story in the context in which we are talking about it right now. So It felt very personal and important to me to go here, even though it's Dave's selection. So apologies, Dave, if I'm stepping on toes of places you might have wanted to go, but this is how I think about this text and why the dissimilarities between the text of the film, I'm sorry, the original book and the film scream out to me, because I think what I get out of the film is more in sync with what I'm trying to describe here. If that makes sense. Yeah. So anyway, that's huge. What do you think?
Thank you for opening this up, because I'm going to actively and intentionally sort of introduce one germ of affirmation, and then I'm going to invite Dave, because we've talked a lot, to sort of share his thoughts on it, and then I'll maybe chime back in. The one thing that I do want to affirm for you, that even if, and maybe this conversation or even, other thoughts along it will align me directly with what you've expressed, even if they don't line up fully in lockstep, what the bookseller says in the very beginning of the book, or in the very beginning of the film, is, the books you read, you get to be Robinson Crusoe, but it's just a book. And he's like, those books are safe. This book isn't safe. And that is at least one ingredient in how I would stand in a very similar place to what you're talking about, or at least to what, there's a lot more. Again, I'm just sort of keeping it brief so that I can pivot over to let Dave share his thoughts. But that notion of it's not a safe book. When I was watching it this time around, I didn't make a note as a thematic conversation, but I absolutely thought of the scriptures and absolutely thought of the Bible and like the book that reads you while you read it. Mm-hmm. And we can unpack a lot of the ways in which that relationship plays out and what that looks like. I think that's definitely worth, rattling around and considering. So I just wanted to throw that in as sort of a soft affirmation before I give Dave the chance to share his thoughts back. Dave, I want you to have the floor. I feel like I've hogged it.
That's powerful. I think that for me, my own reflections, that kind of fast tracks to kind of where I ended in my own reflections. This idea, this notion of making sense of the text. I don't know if this makes any sense, but this is kind of dialoguing with the difference in the book and the movie. I think the reason why the movie works the way that it does is because it narrows everything down to the book itself. It makes the book a more prominent, take a more prominent role in the story, whereas in the book, there are other ways, there are other ways to get into Fantastica.
Fantasia.
Fantasia.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's Fantastica in the book.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah.
Fantasia. There are other ways to get to Fantasia, so it's not tied to the book, but it's tied to this notion of story. And I think what really struck me when I was reflecting on what you're sharing there, Nathan, is that really, when I think of scripture, when you engage with scripture, you see this happen all the time. You see these pivotal points where it comes in the narrative, and these pivotal points where they basically pause and retell the same story again, but in the context of their present circumstance. And that's how the text lives and breathes and kind of gets recontextualized into our life. There's this kind of this both end. You see that I think this is in the book and not the movie, but you see that in Bastian needing to reread this story over and over again before he finds himself in it.
Yeah.
Right. And he eventually finds his own story popping up. And I think there's something powerful in how that works to kind of push us to this place where, the Empress talks about this not being about this not being about being stuck in our present fears, but the whole reason for this journey is so that we can step back into our reality, into our real lives, and enact change. And there's something powerful about how that text, that story, kind of translates itself into our present circumstance in a way that makes sense, in a way that carries the truth that is present in Fantasia over into our lives in unique ways. But it pushes us away from ourselves ultimately, right, and towards the other. That's the whole point of this journey, where the Empress says in the end, says that to Atreyu, that as you're participating with Bastion, or Bastion's participating in your story, other people are participating in Bastion's story.
Yeah, I love that.
And and that pushes into this return to his life, in the real world, so to speak, and where he gets to reorient his vision of the world there, so as to see the other people that are following his story, or that his story can impact, and the other stories that he can enter into at the same time.
No, absolutely. Well, and what it brought me to mind of, yes and amening to all of that, is when she said, just as he's been watching your story, other people are watching his. Again, in the moment of watching, and I'm not going to make a direct parallel because I think that would almost be reductive to the idea, but it reminded me of the Hebrews chapter 12 passage, which talks about the cloud of witnesses that are, and it's talking about, in the context of Hebrews, it's talking about those who have come before watching us now, and it's a fascinating passage in the scriptures about the relationship of faith across generations, and the cloud of witnesses that had gone before and had sort of paved the path of faith, and that in many ways they are watching us. I never have gotten the impression from that passage as if they were somehow sitting in judgment, like with their arms folded, like, well, what are you going to do? But that we are ourselves intricately tied into the thread of everything. Like, I think a lot about the line in the Hamilton musical, "History has its eye on you." I think a lot about that line. Not because I consider myself to be of any importance, or that I think that history will remember who I am in any iota, but the concept of, if there is any sort of importance, moral gravity or weight to the decision that I have, it may not be, if I say of myself and remind myself, read, do right, live justly, love mercy, walk humbly. If I say those kinds of things and I prompt myself to do so by saying history has its eye on you, God, maybe it's not political pundits on Capitol Hill, and maybe it's not, the history of, cinema or writing or anything else. Maybe it's just the history of my son, but history has its eye on you. Like the people in our lives that, and I'm not saying that to this degree of like, oh, we walk in fear or, cripple ourselves over analyzing every choice that we make. And in that way, I love the idea of, we read the stories, we look at the lives, and I'm gonna bring it intentionally in a second, if I can steer it effectively there, back to directly to Scripture, which you were talking about, Nathan. But the notion of the things that had come before, and we absorb that, and we read that, and we learn from it, and we digest it. And then in that same way, we are making the story as we move towards it and further into it. We are participating in it. There are people I know who believe that everything is already set, and that everything is already sort of fashioned, and that we begin to just sort of move through it with a kind of a determinism and an inevitability, that there is no degree of choice. Well, I shouldn't say no degree of choice, but that fundamentally everything is kind of going to play itself out the way that it was always going to play itself out. That is a concept that I wrestle with a lot. I couldn't even sit here right here in this moment and say I openly reject that notion, nor would I sit here and say, yes, I believe that way. It is literally something that I duke it out with in my day-to-day life. All I do know and do believe in that conversation is, okay, I'll say it this way. Last week, I talked about, from my own perspective, about hanging our faith on outcomes and hanging our faith on, like, well, this is the end result of, you put in the recipe, you put in the formula, you get the cake or the cookies come out of the oven, like that's the outcome of it. And I remember I expressed that last week, and I remember I was talking with some friends about the subject of prayer and about how we should pray, the mindset, the manner in which we should pray. And I went to a place that maybe I've shared on the show before, maybe I haven't, maybe it's just been personal reflections. But when it comes to the subject of prayer, I try very hard not to lean myself on, okay, I'm going to pray and God's going to do, or I'm going to pray and X will happen, or Y will happen. Instead, I approach prayer very largely this way, and hopefully this will land and not scandalize all of our listeners. I ask myself about any subject, whether it be my own mental well-being, the health and status of my family, my life, my friends, work things I'm trying to accomplish, creative things I'm trying to accomplish, anything. I ask myself this question: what if the difference between one outcome and another depended entirely upon whether or not I prayed about it? And if I ask myself that question and enter into my prayers with that question, that positions me in my situation somewhat more humbly and somewhat more receptive to be able to just sort of navigate whatever is next in the hope and fulfillment and belief that it is not in vain. And in many ways, I approach the scriptures the same way. Nathan, you expressed, I think, very, very in a very lovely way, this notion of like a symbiotic relationship, but just this notion of there's an interplay. It's a circular thing. And I think we do ourselves, and maybe I'll end my rant here and invite responses from either or both. I think we do ourselves a disservice if we were to approach prayer, scripture, a walk with God in almost any degree with a rigidity that says that thing is locked and I am the only variable that is fluidly moving around it. I think that's not a relationship. You can't have a relationship with a stone, and you can't have the only, as soon as I said that, the only relationship you can have with a stone is if you're a sculptor. And that's the only way that you can have a relationship with sort of this non-living thing. And I believe that the scriptures, talk about a rather bold statement, I believe that the scriptures are alive. I do not believe that they are captured and rigid in some cold, hard thing. I believe they live, and I believe they live in me when I read them, and I believe they live beyond me, whether I read them or not. And that's something that whenever I think about it, I try to say, like, okay, so what if the difference between this thing or that thing entirely pivoted on whether or not I prayed about it, whether or not I spent time in the scriptures about it. Anyway, I hope I'm not rambling at the moment, but that's what some of your question has ignited in me personally. Does any of that resonate at all with either of you? It doesn't have to.
Any thoughts, Dave?
Yeah, there's so many thoughts there I could go down. I did want to pick up. You mentioned Hebrews, and I think this actually fits with. It's funny. I wrote this down. this fits with what both of you are saying in a way. It's from a book from a scholar named Amy Peeler. She wrote a book called "You Are My Son: The Family of God in the Epistle of the Hebrews." And I was listening to an interview with her, and one of the things she said is that we are so conditioned to following this translation that says, because Hebrews is a book that really anchors itself in a lot of the Old Testament scriptures, as well as most New Testament scriptures would. But it uses this phrase, it is written, in the book, but the better translation is actually it is spoken. And there's this connection between, I don't know, in the movie, I've been wrestling with how that connects with this notion of speaking the name.
Yeah.
That whole plot, that whole part of the plot, in connection with what you're talking about, the notion of the book as a text, as a living, breathing text. But what I really found powerful about what Peeler kind of walked through in terms of the Hebrews text was saying how when you walk through the book of Hebrews, what you get is you get this way in which Scripture retells the Eden text, or the Eden story and the Exodus story, and that part of the narrative. But it retells it with an eye for their present circumstance, and much in the same way that we see the Gospels doing with Jesus. Like, they're anchoring Jesus' story in the story of Israel. And she says this, I wrote this down as a part of what she said, but it says he doesn't construct, the author of Hebrews, as in he is speaking and then invents prose. It is always the text of Israel that God is speaking within that. There's choice and construction and contextualization. There's a shaping of a particular dimension, God's character, and preeminently, a particular dimension of God's character, and preeminently this is that God is trustworthy. And I thought that quote kind of captured that notion of this never-ending story, because what is it that makes it never-ending? Is this openness, this kind of, this place where you come and you say, well, this is the participatory part of our faith, right? This is where we enter into the story, and we do what the Eden story was really all about, was to create and fill the earth. Like, it's a particular story with a universal reach, right?
I love that.
We're called to participate in the whole of creation.
Right.
Reed, I think in just one episode, Dave's trying to show up your book drops, your name drops.
Hey, I concede. I relinquish it. No, it's fantastic. And it's lovely. Like, when I used to more prominently and far more frequently, when I used to be like in young adult ministry, which I guess some people would call it like a college and career ministry. And I used to actually like preach some of the sermons, and regardless of whenever I would be given the opportunity to preach a sermon, what I would usually say is, what you're about to hear is less a sermon and more a story that we're going to sit down in together. That's usually what I would say. I would say, like, we're going to, and sometimes it would be expository to, I would piece, texts together from different parts of the Bible that would make a central point. But in a lot of ways, the way that I would try to engage the scriptures in a ministerial capacity would be to take a story and then just walk through the story and sit down in certain places and try to look around at the people that were there that lived the story, and tried to be conscientious of the fact that, and I'll say this way, when the Hebrew children before the fiery furnace, David before Goliath, Noah before the flood, Abraham before Isaac, any of those kinds of things, we lose sight of the fact, I have said this before on the pod, but we lose sight of the fact that they did not know the end result of their story. They were in the story. They were just in it. not knowing exactly how things were going to turn out. And I think when we lose sight of that, we think that somehow the principles of our faith and the principles of walking through our faith feel like they should be like easier than they sometimes really are. And what I mean by easy is it's just like that way that we all hate, where people can get super reductive about the human frailties that we have, and like, oh, well, why don't you just be better? Well, okay, you be better. You know, like all these ways that we can just get hyper reductive in what people are struggling with. And I like when I'm reading a text of the scripture, particularly a narrative one, sitting down in that story and looking around and realizing, like, yeah, Mary and Martha didn't know Lazarus were going to raise. Like, they didn't realize, they weren't sitting there thinking like, oh, okay, this'll all be better in 4 days. Like, everything will be fine. So endure. No, 4 nights, and I'm going to do it in kind of a lighthearted way, but I mean this, and it's actually pretty profound to me. For like a story like Lazarus, where Jesus had sent back word that Lazarus's sickness would not end in death, he sits in the tomb. And for 4 nights, they sat there. These flesh and blood human beings sat there with a promise from Christ himself that this sickness would not end in death, and he's buried. And what does that mean? And what does that look like? And how do we walk through that? And then you transmit that somehow to us in our own present situations when we grapple and wrestle with the never-ending patience of God to intervene in a situation, or the question mark of whether or not this is really all up to us, all of those kinds of things. I think there's a profound missing piece when we don't consider ourselves participatory, when we don't recognize that we are invited into it. It is not about us, and it's about us. Mm-hmm. It is something that was written and experienced, that now there's a cloud of witnesses, like as we walk through it and experience it. You know, a scripture like Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and forever absolutely talks about his divine eternal sovereignty. Absolutely, it talks about his divine eternal presence, all of those kinds of things. But I hear that, and I also recognize that what has come before is now here again and will come again. And right now in this moment, I am invited into this story to participate and to, what's that Dead Poet Society line?
Oh, Captain, gosh. My Captain.
No, that's a good one. But no, he says he's quoting a poem, and I didn't expect to think about it, and now I don't remember the quote. But he is quoting a poem to his students. Keating, the character Robin Williams plays, is he says, you know, the great play goes on, or the great poem goes on, or something, and I may contribute a verse. That's the phrase that stood out to me. I might contribute a verse. There's a chapter in here. In this never-ending story, whether that be scripture or any version of how we want to contextualize our life, there's a chapter in here in which I can participate. I can contribute to this. I can contribute to it in a substantive and fruitful way, or I can contribute to its deterioration, and I can contribute to its decay. I can participate in this, and that invitation is like, I can choose to accept it or not, but not choosing to accept it is a choice. and I will have, I guess I should say it this way, like, I'm participating, I'm in it. And the measure and degree of how I participate and what that end result will be is up to me. But you know, there's no way that I can kind of like bow out from it. I am going to participate into this story because that's the depth of the invitation. I don't know. It's sparking a lot of things, and I don't know how many of them are landing. But
can I share a quote from the book?
Please.
I think because as I'm listening to you speak, I'm thinking about that scene where Atreyu basically comes and comes to the what's her name? The
Empress.
Empress.
Yeah.
Losing the word there. Comes to the Empress, and he basically, and the Empress tells her or tells him that she knew about the child. And Atreya's response in that moment is, "You knew? Like, I just went through all of this and you knew. I'm here to tell you something that you already know." What was the point of this journey, right? And I just found that such a powerful moment and a powerful question to be posed, because I think that gets at the heart of this trying to reconcile this reality that we experience with Fantasia, which is this reflection of a greater hope, a greater reality, something that is more or gives greater meaning to what to what it is that we're experiencing, because these two things don't match up, right? And I think this quote from the book, I think, gets at, for me anyway, really gets at this wrestling with these two realities, right? The reality of Fantasia and the reality of our lives here on Earth. And it says, "I wonder," he said to himself, Bastian, "what's in a book while it's closed? Oh, I know it's full of letters printed on paper, but all the same, something must be happening, because as soon as I open it, there's a whole story with people I don't know yet, and all kinds of adventures and deeds and battles. And sometimes there are storms at sea, or it takes you to strange cities and countries. All those things are somehow shut up in a book. Of course, you have to read it to find out, but it's already there. That's the funny thing. I just wish I knew how it could be." And this that quote just, to me, rings true with this sense of the story that is there, that we're willing to step into, needs something that we can trust, right? And in this reality, when I think about it as a young kid, looking at my world as the things that didn't make sense, my experience at school, when you're somebody getting put in a garbage can, it's like you don't think that you can trust this world. And no wonder I just wanted to go into books and escape, because it took me somewhere else, right? And yet this book is dangerous, because it pushes us back out into that very world and says, here's how you're going to make sense of this. And yet it does so saying you can trust. And what can we trust in? Well, I think the picture here is that we get in Neverending Story is Bastian is playing, I personally think he's playing both the Christ figure and the image bearer on both sides of the fence. Like, I think he's the one, because the Empress actually says, this is how we are going to save all of this is going to be saved, is through Bastian's sacrifice. And, Bastian being this one that's able to give of himself in human form. It can only be a human child, right? And to give of himself, that becomes the central truth of that story, that can say, now you can trust in your role as image bearers, as being like Christ and going out into the world because of what I did. Christ is central, and Christ pushes us out then to participate. I don't know if that makes sense, but
no. Well, and here's what he
comes riding not a white horse, but a white luck dragon.
Yeah.
Well, and here's immediately what you were saying. It resonated profoundly with me, and what he has to do seems so simple: is give a new name, and the new name that he gave was very personal to him. It was of himself. Like he gave. He says it's his mother's name, or that he has. Or that his mother had a beautiful name, and then the name he yells out the window is Moonchild. I have to imagine that his mother's name was not actually Moonchild, but must have been, I don't know, something that was an affectionate thing.
German.
I can't remember. Sure, and I can't remember how the book articulated it. But what stood out to me so much with what you were saying, Dave, is I hear a lot about when either politics gets into play or hypocrisy gets into play. What do people say about the faith? You're giving Christianity what? A bad name. You're giving it a bad name. And that's a phrase that keeps getting repeated in different contexts. You're giving this group a bad name, or you're giving that situation a bad name, or you're giving people like you a bad name. And I rarely hear anybody say like, oh, you're giving a good name to whatever, like it's a good name. But what struck me so much about when you were just saying this and talking about the power of what Bastian is being tasked to do is good or bad. He's just tasked with bringing something new to it, like bring a new name to it. And I'm thinking in this moment, which again, check your bingo cards, Fog listeners, because I'm processing this in real time. But the thing that really stands out to me is that is the wild, wild thing that Christ has trusted us with, is representing him to the world. And what a profound, profound risk he's taking. Like what an insane risk he's taking, that he compels us to be his hands and feet to the world, and to give it a new name, that new name being directly tied back to who we are. And that's not to say, lest anybody think I'm going down some kind of weird, hokey path, that's not to say that like, oh, now suddenly Christ becomes Reed or whatever. That's not really what I'm saying. I'm saying that, in these moments, as we continue to participate and give of ourselves in it, as you said, like, we are representing sometimes simultaneously, like we are being Christ to other people, and bringing him to other people. It's personal and it's other. It is individual and it's communal. It's all of those things wrapped up together at the same time, which is why it's so mysterious. But it's something that, again, we are tasked and challenged with bringing something new, and that newness need only be, as it was with Bastian, it doesn't need to be the best name anybody could ever give anybody. It doesn't need to be, the reason it was the exact right choice is because it was his choice, and the reason and because it was something new. And again, anyway, I think that a lot of times we task ourselves, maybe this will represent better what I'm kind of trying to scratch at. I think we task ourselves with being a certain degree of good or not, instead of being about the person that God designed us to be in the story that he's placed us into. Because I do think there's a lot of intentionality about that. We're here right now, 2021, April, the end of April. By the time this episode releases, first little bit of May, 2021. We're here, we're now, we're in it. And I have to believe that if there is design to any of this, that was intentional. And a lot of times people may think, oh, well, that means I've got all this pressure to do something good with my life, even as we're talking about contributing a verse or participating in the thing. And I think for myself, where I'm at, participating and contributing something good means, to the best of my ability, walking with God to try to find out who he truly made me to be in the moment. Not so that I can build an empire, not so that I can, build some sort of like fancy, laudable thing, but just so that I can be who he designed me to be in the moment. And that, trusting in that I have contributed something of value to the story in which I was invited. I really hope to God I'm making sense, because this is just the chaos that's swirling around inside my brain. But Nathan, you've been awfully quiet. I feel like this is a dialogue between me and Dave that you've been.
I'm just, I'm taking it in. I never knew it was that beautiful. With my big, strong hands. man, I know this is Dave is present, and so he's going to be, kind of here, but this is like real talk. I know what you mean, but I want to challenge just a speed bump you laid out there, Reed, of you, because I know why, and I get it, and I know what, but it's been a minute, but the phrasing you basically said was, Christ does not read. How did you say that? Do you remember? You were trying to distance yourself from what?
That basically saying like, I'm not Christ. I can't save the world. So Christ doesn't suddenly become Reed.
And we aren't sinless, blameless, flawless, faultless. But my turn for boldness and heresy. I don't know that I buy that anymore. We are because this is the story. We participate in saving the ivory tower. It is like, and you aren't the man Jesus. You are the man Reed, embodying Christ likeness into the world and transforming it with every step, and riding luck dragons to vanquish and undercut injustice and rebuild and reimagine and reshape reality into the good and the beautiful. I mean, damn, that's it. Like, you are that. We are that. And I know what you were doing, because you're a sensitive person and you are delicate with your words, and you don't want to offend a traditional sort of paradigm, but I will. And I'll say, because it's so funny, this weird thing that has happened to me over time. Like, I remember 20 years ago, this idea of bearing Christ likeness had this weird, like, I didn't even know what that I would have meant if I'd said that to me 20 years ago. But like, I think it is, this is me. I think distancing yourself from that, and I'm not chastising you, Reed, by any means.
No, I don't feel chastised.
Kind of interrogating the notion. I think distancing ourselves from that concept reverts scripture to words and not the living story that we are. It's like a membrane that you open it and you walk in and you carry that energy into the world with you. And maybe it's my crazy weirdo progressivism of the last 10 years, kind of creating the tip of the spear here. But I want to challenge anyone who's like, well, I'm not supposed to save the world or whatever. Yeah, because that's too damn big for anybody. Yeah, absolutely. You aren't. But you are supposed to redeem the land around you. You are supposed to make good and beautiful and true the space in which you inhabit. Because if not, Gamork is going to run wild and eat it all up. Like, that is the story.
Yes.
Sorry.
No, I receive your pivot, and I think I can articulate better what I'm trying to say. I think there's a big difference between bearing Christ likeness and redefining Christ likeness. And I think for myself, one of the things that I'm conscientious of, not because I'm scared of offending anybody, but because I'm really scared of where my ego would go if I let it go to that degree of saying I define what Christ likeness looks like.
Well, sure.
And so I'm always present of, that doesn't just mean, in my mind, recognizing that if I bring it a new name, that doesn't just mean, okay, well, Reed is what God is like. No, Christ is, in my theological framework, Christ is what God is like, and I am trying to be like Christ, and I'm trying to bring a bearing of Christ likeness to it. And so when I make a distinction, and maybe this wouldn't change one word of what you challenged there, but when I bring a distinction, I'm like, I don't think I'm redefining what Christ likeness is. I think I'm entering into it and bringing maybe to the moment some specificity that would not be in other contexts there. There's no way that, like, my presence here in this place would translate globally. if I was across the world in a total other culture or anything like that. So there's a lot of specificity to it. And I think I always try to keep myself, again, I just want to, what I'm sort of really hanging a lantern on is I am not worried of offending people. I'm worried of letting my ego go unbridled and say like, well, I get to define what Christ is in this moment, and Christ is this. And so I'm challenging myself to remember, no, I'm in a relationship of bearing Christ likeness, not of the work of redefining it. I don't know if that changes any of what you would challenge, because I know I said it poorly earlier, but that's, I think, more what I'm scratching at, is that I don't get to define it.
Yes. And all I'm trying to interrogate, not your words, but what I perceive in the culture, the Christian culture at large, is a distancing, well, I'm not. He did the work is finished. And I'm ignoring the broader nuances of that. The work is finished. I'm not a participant in that. It happened. It saved me. It saved my buddies. I get to unplug and not really worry. And I mean, I hope you come to person on the street, but it's really not going to matter to me. And I think that's what I'm trying to interrogate, is that distancing that happens, that makes the living word ink and paper. That's what I'm trying to say.
So I really, man, this conversation is like just about the time that we're probably getting close to a wind down, and I'm feeling like some energy and everything. I said something earlier, and I do think there is a big difference between these different things. I said the only way you can have a relationship with a stone is if you're a sculptor, and then actively later it was as if some distant thing in my brain was like, boy, you just insulted every geologist in the world. I was just, but it opened up something in my mind that I do think is a prescient distinction, or at least I think it is. I think you can have a relationship with books. You can have a relationship with stones. You can have a relationship with people that is pure study and is pure information gathering and information cataloging. And that's where it ends. And I think for a lot of people in their faith, that's where it is. Let me get in here and study to the degree so that I know the mechanics and define those. And what you're scratching at, Nathan, would then be very tempting to say like, nope, I'm just here to relay information. That's all I am
comprehend.
Doing.
Yep.
Yes, I'm here to comprehend, and I'm here to relay information. And geologists certainly have a much more robust relationship with rocks than I'm defining it right now. I'm just creating a paradigm, okay? But a sculptor, that story that Locke tells when he and Boone are trying to get into the hatch, and he tells the story about when Michelangelo was trying to sculpt David, and he would come to the chunk of rock and just sit and stare at the chunk of rock. And they would ask him what he's doing. He said, he's working. The sculptor has a relationship with this because he sees what it could be and what is there with the right hands upon it. And I think in many ways, that old song that like God is the potter and we are the clay, like we are being made in the moment, even as we are making in the moment. And I think that's part of the mystery of that relationship, is you can enter into it as, as a sculptor to a degree, and have that version of relationship with what is happening around you. And creation, I mean, what is the divine spark and the image bearing if it does not start with creation? Let there be. And I think that is part of something that we are compelled towards, drawn towards, called towards, and whatever that means is. And I think it would be really, really sad if not just, sad, but dead within you, if all it was a catalog of information. My most frustrating conversations in life and social media interaction is when anybody ends the conversation with just like, well, this is what it says. Yeah. I ain't gonna argue with it because this is what it says, and there it is. And it's like, are we not alive? Are we not breathing? Are we not digesting this? Are we not wrestling with it? The way Jacob wrestled with the angel all night, and got crippled in the process, and walked away with what? A new name. to get back to the story a bit. You know, it's like that's how new names are born out of this. It's out of this wrestling. It's out of this relationship. We're talking some lofty ideas, Dave, like really big stuff. Go ahead.
You're all this talk about rocks. I feel like we would be remiss not to, if I could bring in the rock biter for a second.
Nice pivot, Dave.
Nice. You know, those
skillfully
delicious limestones. I think this might intersect with that conversation, and it actually brings it to another piece of the puzzle of what this film means for me personally. But the rock biter in the book, he takes a different role. What the movie does, and I think this is one of the things that I love the most about the movie adaptation, is the way that it uses, like it repositions the rock biter as the bookends for the kind of this kind of bookend for the story at the as he carries through these pivotal points in the film, because we begin with the rock biter. Really, he's one of the most looming presences in that opening scene, right? Is this rock biter, and you just see him reminiscing about this beautiful place that is being consumed by the nothing, and he's just lost in this place of uncertainty. And then I remember the line where he kind of approaches they're first approaching the tower or whatever it is, where the Empress is, and he says, I never imagined it could be this beautiful, like something. He goes from this just like sorrowful reminiscing to this, wow, like this is a new picture here, like this is something more beautiful than I could have imagined. And it opens up this view, but contrast that with one of his final scenes there where you know, he gives that speech about looking at his hands and saying, man, I once thought these hands were so strong and capable. And you contrast that with the story of the film, like the larger story of the film, and you get this sense of, man, this is where I think this is where it comes into play in my own story, my own personal story, because you see this all through the film, like with the old couple that I love there, the scientists, right? There, I thought it was so neat that the scientist is trying to find answers, and he readily admits, I can't get the answers. Like I'm stuck here. And, you know, the answers eventually come with somebody that's able to break that barrier and somehow gain a grasp of the mystery that's beyond, that stands beyond these statues, right? That can face the fears and uncover this mystery and make this mystery known. But that mystery doesn't come in answers. It comes with this increased tension. And I think that's what I found so powerful in the rock biter. And it just looking at his hands and saying, at the sea of possibility, right, where you can go no further, and saying, what else do we have left when it feels like everything's been taken away? And I think that moment strikes me personally because, Nathan, you talked about this movie meaning something as a child. I experienced this movie as a child, and it meant something in me that I couldn't understand at the time. But in my older years, this movie meant something that I was able to articulate in my story in something that I could more readily understand, in a way that I could more readily understand. And I remember, sorry, I'm now going into my story here.
No, by all means.
I remember, I would say this was probably the darkest night of my soul. was a moment in my life where I came to that place where that sea of possibility just felt like it could go no further. And this world around me just seemed like it was a moment where I found myself isolated, alone, uncertain. I had lost a lot of my faith. I had lost a lot of myself. I was just very, very alone, lost, and not knowing how to move forward. And I remember in that place feeling like I could not reconcile this fantasia with my reality. Like these things did not make sense for me anymore. And I remember in that moment just feeling this sense of despair. And I just came to that point where I looked at my hands, which was my life. Sorry, I didn't mean to get emotional here.
Yeah.
And I just said, I can't do this anymore. Like that was, it made sense to me that this world, as it was better left than experienced. And I remember coming to that point, and you know, the name of the the name of the film, The Neverending Story, and this notion of being able to call out a name. I remember saying a prayer in that moment, this one particular night, where I felt like I was done, and I couldn't go any further. And I just said a prayer. I mean, call it my naming, call it my whatever. And I got up the next morning after that night thinking I was so empty, like everything in me was gone. And I just remember thinking, I don't know, like I felt like this was it. I don't know how this ends, but I just remember being on my bike and wandering aimlessly. And lo and behold, to me, this was my grain of sand moments. Somebody had been praying for me that previous night and had a letter for me that actually recounted my prayer.
What?
Wow.
And that letter was given to me, and it basically, I mean, to boil it down, it basically was a call to remember, and to remember the specific moment in my life. And ever since then, I've spent that time trying to, reconcile this world in a different way from a new vantage point. Like I talked about that book from M.T. Wright at the beginning.
Yeah.
And he talks about how the temple, the Genesis narrative is a temple text. And he talks about how this temple, this picture of the temple is actually, it's meant to symbolize the meeting of heaven and earth, because these things have been torn apart and we feel like these things can't be reconciled. And the temple symbolizes this meeting place of heaven and earth where these things come together. They're no longer torn apart. And I think that picture to me was so powerful because he imagines this temple as in the place where heaven and earth meets. And then he imagines the temple standing in line with the Sabbath, what he calls the Sabbath, as the time in which we get to participate in this new reality where heaven and earth now meet in Christ as the temple raised, right? And what is that in the creation story is a temple with us being placed in it as its idols, like in the center, the image bearers. That's what happens in the ancient world, is that's the last thing to be placed in the temple is the idols. And that happened to be us. With the sole purpose of stepping out into this world. But as the story goes in Genesis, unfortunately, the reality of the wilderness on the other side and the garden on this side seem irreconcilable when faced, with the way life actually is. And one of the things N.T. Wright challenges us to do is to step in the part of the story where we find Christ's resurrection and take a view over the rest of the story from there, because if we start in our present circumstance, we're just going to find all kinds of ways to say this can't be. We can't do this. This can't be reconciled. But reading it back from that piece of the puzzle, it gives us something to trust in. It gives us something to hope in. And it says, this reality has a place in this new creation, this new world that has been set in play, right?
Yeah.
Dave, thank you for that story and for sharing.
Amen. Yeah, I know that thank you for your honesty and your vulnerability. Very, very powerful. This would be one of the moments that we should, and we will in just a second, probably pivot over to the fog meter and sort of land the plane. But what you brought out, land the Falcor. Yes. What you touched on so beautifully. We haven't spent a lot of time in this conversation talking about the nothing. And, I think that's something that, in my mind, when I think about that feeling of powerlessness, and even like the creature, the Gamork that was trying to help it, he said, whoever holds the power, or when people feel powerless, they're easier to control. I forget his exact line and I didn't write it down, but he talks about he was helping the nothing because it was control. And that feeling of despair, when we confront that situation and we come to grips with the reality that we are not in control. And despite our strength and despite our skill and despite everything, I said earlier in the episode, talking about one of my deep, big fears is just losing control of my faculties. That's a concern. As I will begin to age, it hovers in terms of that notion. But there's a real hope, a real spark, that line when, after like Fantasia blows up and he screams the name out into the night, the very next scene is just black, and that line is so lovely, where he says, "Why is it so dark?" And she says, "It's always dark in the beginning," because the nothing, talks about, like, I hear nothing, and then especially as you were sharing your story, the without form and void kept sort of coming back around as a synonym to the concept of the nothing, without form and void. And as God spoke into that and said, "Let there be," may we also find in ourselves the spark as the image bearers to have the same kind of faith to maybe step forward and to speak something into that formless void, not only for ourselves in our own world, but also maybe for others around us. It's just really, it's a lovely thought. I don't know that I'm articulating it justly, but it's something that really, it's lovely to think about, and thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely. I am good to go to the fog meter if you, my pair of cohorts, are also good to go to the fog meter.
Let's do it.
Good.
Say we yay? Okay, all right. So the fog meter is our very specific metric of fear and God, the way that we rate these films, or any material that we cover anyway, on its scares and its substance. The Wolfgang Peterson directed The Never-Ending Story, based on the book by Michael Ende. On the fear measurement, I'm gonna go first. And on the fear measurement, as I was watching it back through, I remember, because I watched it as a child, I remember asking my wife, "Should I show this to our son?" And she was like, "You better not do that to this child. Like, do not. This movie is scary. Do not do this to this child." And as I was watching, I was like, "Man, it is quite scary in a number of ways, both in some of the things that it thinks about and some of the horror stuff." I'm actually going to give it an 8 on the freaking fear meter, because there's a lot of like really sort of deeply despairing and kind of heavy things in it. So I know that's harsh, but or high, but yeah, 8. Dave, what would you rate Neverending Story?
Has anybody given their choice less than 10? I feel like I have to. It's my choice for what scares me. So
that's true.
That's true. That's a fair point. That's a fair point and a good justification. Nathan, what would you say?
It's funny. I was thinking about this today, and I'm going to go with my gut and say a 6. I do think there is some legitimately harrowing imagery. I'm using this word actually as a positive. It's a very weird movie. Yeah, and sure. And kind of that weirdness makes it a kind of unsettling experience. But in most of the ways I would categorize Scary or Not, it doesn't quite fit that bill, though Gomorrah is pretty scary, and it's a very scary image. Yeah. The Swamp of Sadness is pretty intense, but I think for me a 6 feels right and safe.
Makes sense. What would you give it for the God measurement?
Me?
Yeah, you, Nathan. Sorry.
On that, I will give it a 10. There's just an insane, like, even this conversation, I'm like, this is too big. There's just so much
right
kind of at work that I'm sure there are whole other avenues we could have pursued that are at the moment not on my mind, but are there. So yeah, I mean, it's highly imaginative, highly lovely, and intentionally so on both counts, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Dave, what would you give it on the God meter? Its substance, if you will.
I would also give it a 10 because, and I firmly believe, because my understanding is that the author of the story was very much a committed Christian and wrote from a position of faith. Especially in the context of the Second World War, which he was trying to reconcile himself. And he has, I think, a lot of the imagery is very intentional. So I think, and obviously it comes out very easily from even the film, even in the ways that it's different. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, y'all, this is going to be a trifecta. I was going to give it a 10 on the God meter myself. I think that Nathan, you mentioned we probably have only touched on maybe a third of the different subjects and lines that we could draw out, and then just have entire another hours of conversation about, just individual lines like that. It is rich in substance. And so I give it a 10 as well. And that means that we 3 give the Neverending Story a 9 out of 10 on the fog meter. Yeah. That is an impressive showing. That is an absolutely impressive showing for the fog meter. And probably not with that rating, and probably not with this film, but the harder / maybe easier this time question would be, would you recommend the Neverending Story? Dave, would you recommend the Neverending Story?
Absolutely, yeah.
Why would you, sure. Nathan? Would you recommend it?
Yeah. I mean, again, it's weird, and from a pure accessibility, if somehow someone just absolutely wasn't familiar with this as an adult, it's like that's a tough pill to swallow. But from a pure standpoint of what we've been talking about, how it lodged in the psyche from a young age, yeah, absolutely, I'd recommend this movie.
I am gonna make a bold statement.
Yeah.
Me? I think this is one of the 10 greatest fantasy films in cinema history. I would recommend it that highly because I feel like, now you got to count Lord of the Rings as one movie instead of 3 movies.
Well, in which case 10 feels like a really big number. Would you call it one of the top 3? If the Lord of the Rings trilogy is one piece?
That might be tough. I don't know that I'm putting it in top 3 here, but the reason that I say that and why I recommend it so highly is because, we didn't get into a lot of the technical stuff about it, but I remember watching this and thinking, dang, man, I miss practical costumes and sets and
whole time
and all that kind of stuff. Like this, models built instead of CGI stuff. It's just it is totally rapturous to just sort of get caught up in all of that. And so yeah, I highly recommend it. I do agree with what you're saying about some of the limits of its present accessibility, but man, I love it, and I recommend it so highly. Dave, thank you for giving us the chance to
absolutely
honestly bare our soul, we may listen back to this and be like, yeah, I said that, really? Okay. But
I'm gonna listen back and be like, Reed said that, really?
That usually happens. Like, oh man, Reed said that, didn't he?
That was a bold statement there, Reed.
But Dave, sincerely, thank you so much, not only for recommending that we cover Neverending Story, but for being willing to join us and participate in this conversation as well. We've really loved having you. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your insights on this. We appreciate it very, very much.
Well, thank you.
And so listeners, as I mentioned in business time, we are going to be going next week, not only to the film, which I'll mention in a second, but also check out the first 2 episodes of The Witcher, the Netflix original series. And we'll be covering that, building up. That was another What Scares Us submission. And so we're just going to be making our way through beginning that with the first 2 episodes next week. But the film that we're going to be covering, also a What Scares Us submission, is the one another, like if you thought the Neverending Story was kind of out of the box, we are going to be going next week to, Dead or Alive. We're going next week to the one and only RoboCop, directed by Paul Verhoeven.
Dave's learning in real time.
He's like, what is happening? So next week we are going to be going to RoboCop, which is a bit of an unconventional choice, but I think the reasons surrounding it were quite apropos. So check out that film if you've not seen it, and join us next week. Dave, thank you so much again. Nathan, thank you as always for having these conversations, and listeners, thank you as well. As we say on every episode, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, but not the end of the conversation. And in that, the never-ending conversation, if you will. And in that spirit, we encourage you to fear nothing else and be on your way rejoicing. We'll see you next week, everybody.
Look around. Tell me what you see.
This keeps going. How far are you gonna go?
If I had the words in front of me, I would go all the way.
The
the
never-ending song.
Yeah.
I think it's actually turn around, not look around. I think it's turn around.
Reed's a jerk, always correcting me.
Me always correcting you. me always correcting you.
Thank you, Dave.
Oh my God!
Being on the show.
Wow.
Okay, I mean we can end now. Dave, thank you for being here. We will see you on the internet. Reed,
right.
I'll see you next week. So what I'm going to do, Reed, I'm going to record Zoom just to have it so that I've got a timestamp, but not for the purposes of having it.